Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is David Ellis. I'm in charge of communications here at the Energy Futures Initiative, and we're proud to welcome everyone here and present our latest report, which is a joint production between EFI and E3 Energy and Environmental Economics. This has been several months in the making, and this morning at a selected sort of invitation only New England Energy Conference, Secretary Moniz gave a keynote address on this report. We know many of you weren't able to join there. And so this is our briefing with the entire team. You'll have an opportunity there'll be a presentation from the team, which includes Liz Metatal and Arnie Olson of E3, and Alex Breckel, who was the project lead for EFI. After that presentation, there'll be questions and answers, an opportunity to ask questions. And we ask everyone during this presentation to use the Q&A section to put those questions in advance, and then they'll be asked of the team. But now it's my pleasure to hand over to EFI's founder, the 13th U.S. Secretary of Energy, and our boss, Ernest Moniz.
All right, well, thanks, David. I missed the drum roll, but it's okay. I want to thank also all of you for joining this EFI E3 briefing on our new report, Net Zero New England, Ensuring Electric Reliability in a Low Carbon Future. It was a pleasure, I should add, to collaborate with E3, a company with a long track record for analyzing the electricity industry. We also thank Calpine for supporting the analysis, but I do want to emphasize strongly that the report is the product of the EFI and E3. You're going to hear the specifics from my EFI and E3 colleagues, but it won't be a surprise that a very profound change of the electricity system is called for, and of the transportation and building sectors as well, since they will be electrified significantly in order for New England to reach the net zero goal. But again, you'll be hearing specifically how in a couple of scenarios that future can evolve. Those bookend scenarios, though, I will just say right now, entail the electricity load going up by at least 60%, perhaps 90%, a very, very significant rise, even after significant energy efficiency gains are made. And in addition, shifting the peak load from summer to winter over the next maybe 15 years, again, important dynamics for the system that our colleagues will discuss. Not surprisingly, renewables, wind and solar, will play a major role, but so will firm electricity. The question is, what sources of firm electricity and perhaps innovation will provide additional options. There are also unanswered questions. How much long-term, larger-scale storage will be needed? How will the significant infrastructure build-outs be accomplished, especially in a region where I come from and know that new infrastructure is routinely challenged in going forward? How and where will carbon dioxide removal be implemented, and at what scale? And there'll be many more questions. Nevertheless, we think the study will provide an important foundation for policymakers and regulators, those in the electricity supply chain, investors and innovators, as they make decisions in the near term that are aligned with the long path to net zero, as we at least try to outline with the analysis in this report. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Alex Breckel to kick off the report briefing. And thank you again.
Great, thanks for those opening remarks. And it's wonderful to be here and presenting on a report that we're very excited to launch at a very critical juncture. Liz, if you could go to the next slide. Great. So the key question for motivating the study, and Secretary touched on it briefly, is how can New England provide affordable, reliable electric power under future scenarios that achieve net zero economy-wide greenhouse gas emissions by 2050? And this is really inherently a regional issue. The geography, the climate, the politics of every region in the country will influence their path to net zero. For example, what makes sense in California, a region that both E3 and EFI have spent a lot of time evaluating, won't necessarily make sense in a region like New England. I think the results that we'll present today bear that out in a really interesting way. And this question of power sector reliability in a low emissions future is timely. The states around the country are moving quickly to implement policies to reduce their emissions substantially by mid-century. And you can see in the map on the right-hand side of the graph here that New England states are really out ahead. Each has a goal of 80% economy-wide emissions reduction by 2050 or greater. Massachusetts has a net zero goal by 2050. And cleaner electricity will be a critical emissions reduction strategy in its own right. There on the bottom, you can see that electricity constitutes roughly 20% of emissions in the region. But I think even more importantly, electricity will be a critical enabler of emissions reductions across a broader swath of the economy. At that same graphic, you can see buildings, transportation alone are roughly 2/3 of emissions in the region. And we expect, and you'll see in the results, that electrification of key end uses will be a huge contributor to emissions reduction and really put some stresses on the grid that they've never witnessed before, as the Secretary again outlined. And at the same time, this greater reliance on electricity for critical services, especially heating and transportation, puts an even higher premium on reliability, especially in a region as cold as New England. So this study looks at some of the finer points of how best to decarbonize the power system. The Secretary stole the bottom line, so I'll just go ahead and go to the next slide, please. Great. Actually, I'll hand it over to Arnie to pick us up on the economy-wide emissions reductions.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you, Alex. And thank you, Secretary Moniz, for kicking us off. My name is Arnie Olson. I'm a senior partner at E3. I think as the Secretary mentioned, we've been involved in a number of these studies throughout North America, particularly deeply involved in California, but also Pacific Northwest and New York and PJM, a number of other regions. And it's always interesting to look at what's similar and what's different across all the different regions. Each power system is a function of its own geography. So you'll probably hear us talking throughout the hour here about the ways in which New England is different and unique, and some of the ways in which New England is similar to other regions. And I'm joined today by Dr. Liz Medital, who will help answer some questions. And I want to make sure that she gets the lion's share of the credit for getting us to the place that we've come to with the report. She and her team really, I think, did an excellent job of wrangling all the various streams of analysis together into a coherent whole. So really thanks to Liz and the team for helping us get here. So the chart here, as Alex mentioned, really describes the economy-wide picture. And it kind of gets to our key finding number one from the report, which is that really large efforts will be needed across every sector of the economy to get to a net zero goal by 2050. So we did start with net zero as our target, kind of recognizing more and more that that's the direction that policymakers are taking us, not just in New England, but really around the country. At the same time, we realize that the technologies don't exist today to really squeeze all of the direct carbon emissions out of the economy. So we did allow ourselves 15% of the emissions to be abated in the form of either offsets or some form of carbon removal, whether that's afforestation, whether it's agricultural practices, or whether it's direct air capture. So in effect, we're modeling 85% direct reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. The non-energy sector you'll see there in the yellow at the bottom of the chart doesn't reduce by very much. That's much harder. So our energy-related emissions are reduced by more than 85%. But really, you'll see there today, transportation is the largest share in New England. That's similar to the Western states as well. 40% or so of the emissions come from transportation. Only about 16% from electric power in the Northeast has already largely been cleaned up. At least the coal has been removed. And then as you go out through 2050, all the sectors are reduced, with the electric sector actually being reduced by by approximately 92% below 1990 levels, to a budget of about 2.5 or 3 million metric tons by 2050. That's what we're holding the electric sector to. Part of the way that we're doing that, as was mentioned, is through electrification of end uses in other sectors. So electrification of the light duty vehicle fleet, much of the medium duty vehicle fleet, and even some of the heavy duty vehicle fleet as well. Electrification of large shares of the heating loads in buildings, and electrification of some of the industrial sector. We have two bookend scenarios. One of them is a high electrification scenario. One of them is a high fuels scenario in which we do less building electrification under the assumption that there's a form of zero carbon fuels that can be used to meet a lot of those burner tip demands in buildings and in industries. So really they're meant to be bookends on the amount of electric load that the electric sector will be expected to serve, and on the amount of effective capacity that the electric sector will need to serve load reliably. So really the challenge becomes in all these cases is how do you meet the peak heating demand in New England throughout the course of the wintertime, and especially during the polar vortex type of events. We see the system becoming winter peaking in the mid to late 2030s under both scenarios, and demand growing quite substantially, peak demand even doubling under the high electrification scenario to up to 50 gigawatts. So if you go to the next slide, please. So I guess I would just mention that's our finding number 2, is that the electric sector will be asked to serve new loads. Electric demand will increase significantly over the next 3 decades, and that's really under all the scenarios that we studied. So this chart shows the electric portfolio that we've modeled to meet those demands. So again, we're serving twice as much load by 2050 as we are today, at the same time that emissions are being reduced to 2.5 million metric tons, and this is how we get there. These are both under the high electrification case. You can see the high fuels case in the report. But on the left-hand side, you see installed capacity. On the right-hand side, you see energy generation from that capacity throughout the year. The colors are the different resource types. The yellow is solar, obviously. The different shades of blue or onshore and offshore wind. Purple in E3 charts is always battery storage. And then we have the fossil resources shaded in different shades of gray. But you can see wind and solar grow substantially between now and 2050. And that includes both land-based utility scale solar and distributed solar. It includes both onshore wind and offshore wind, to where in 2050, it's something like 2/3 of the total energy produced, with nuclear being the remaining zero carbon share, plus some hydropower that's assumed to be imported from Canada, from Hydro-Quebec. So you can see a lot of battery storage is added that both helps to move the solar around into the evening when it can displace natural gas generation. It also helps to serve some of the capacity needs. The other trend that you'll see here is that the gas generation stays largely similar, and in fact even increases through 2050. And we'll talk about this in a couple of slides, but this really we find is necessary to meet the peak demands, which again occur during the wintertime and often are on events with multiple days of low wind and solar production coinciding with very cold temperatures. So really that means a lot of firm capacity is needed, and we even end up adding some new natural gas capacity between now and 2050 to help meet those peak demands reliably. On the right-hand side, you can see those gray wedges shrink over time as is necessary if the region is to meet its carbon goals. So we end up with a system by 2050 in which the vast majority of the energy needs come from a zero carbon source. just really a few days of the year remaining that need to be served with a fuel. And in 2050, we're assuming some form of drop-in fuel is available, zero carbon fuel, to help make even that last remaining section of electricity demand less carbon intensive. And here we've assumed it's hydrogen. It could be a different type of fuel. So if you go to the next slide. We ran a number of sensitivity cases as well. New England is, compared to other regions, fairly land constrained, as you would imagine, with respect to the ability to dedicate land to industrial scale energy production. So in our base set of assumptions, we've assumed that 4%, really a land area equivalent to 4% of the region's farmland is available for solar development, and a land area equivalent to 2% of the region's farm and forest land is available for wind development. So those assumptions end up being fairly constraining. Those combined with the need to build new transmission across New England to bring some of the remote wind and solar to loads. So we end up with a fair amount of offshore wind in the base case scenario, which isn't subject to those same land constraints. If we were to constrain land use even further, we would end up with even more offshore wind and really restrict the ability to develop onshore land-based solar, which significantly increased the cost by 3.3% relative to the base case. On the other hand, if you unconstrain the land and assume that you could just build as much wind and solar as possible anywhere in New England, then you end up with a lot more solar, a lot less offshore wind, just based on cost. And that ends up being actually the lowest cost of all of our scenarios. So this really indicates that renewables are the lowest cost source of energy, clean energy, throughout the time period that we've modeled, using the assumptions and the cost trajectories through 2050 that we've modeled. So that's just a testament to how far that industry has come over the last several years. On the right-hand side, we've now made available some new technologies. So the good news on the left-hand side is we don't, and while EFI is doing lots of good work looking at technology advancement and technology breakthroughs that might help us to reach the 2050 goals, the good news is we don't necessarily need them to reach 2.5 million metric ton goal. We've done that in our base case with technologies that are available in commercial today. So wind, solar, offshore wind, okay, maybe you can say that's not commercial today, although it is obviously deployed in large quantities in Europe, but wind, solar, and batteries with really gas for backup. If we do have technology breakthroughs, if we have carbon capture with sequestration that becomes viable, if we have advanced nuclear that becomes viable, if we have additional fuel types that become viable, all that does, that helps to make the problem less constrained. So it helps to reduce cost and it helps to alleviate some of the other constraints that we see, particularly on land use. So the other three scenarios are ones in which we've made available advanced technologies for baseload clean energy sources, advanced nuclear, natural gas with carbon capture. And then in the last scenario, we've made both of those available. And the model, interestingly, does pick both of them, picks a mix of nuclear and carbon capture, which it operates as a kind of an intermediate unit, along with a nice diverse mix of wind and solar, offshore, onshore, and batteries. And that scenario also is relatively low cost. And it really alleviates a lot of the land use constraints that we see, a lot of the land consumption that we see in the scenarios on the left. So if we think that land use is going to be a significant constraint in New England, the scenarios on the right and investing in new baseload clean energy sources could be pretty important. So if you go to the next slide, please. I just have a couple of slides here where we summarize the cost impacts of the different cases. So here we've used this sort of a policy-free reference case where we assume a 50% renewable portfolio standard for the region. That's what's at the origin point. On the y-axis going to the right is our greenhouse gas emission reductions, and on the x-axis are annual incremental costs. And here we focused on the 2050 endpoint. So incremental costs relative to the reference case. If you look at our 2.5 million metric ton case, you see that case costs about $4.6 billion per year incremental cost relative to that sort of policy-free reference case. And we end up with an average abatement cost of about $190 per ton. So that's not insubstantial. These are real costs. But as the Secretary said this morning, these are costs that ought to be manageable across the broad region like New England. If you go to the next slide, what we find here now, we've superimposed some of the sensitivities onto our base case cost assumptions. And there's three different ones that I'm going to point you to. In the green, so just above the 2.5 million, still meeting the 2.5 million metric tons, but just above the blue, above what we looked at before, is the case in which if we were to restrict and prohibit the construction of new combustion-based resources. So if we don't allow any new natural gas generation to be added to meet the difficult to serve hours of the year during the wintertime, in effect, that ends up doubling the cost of achieving the carbon reductions. So you can still hit your 2.5 million metric ton goal, but you now have to add a lot of resources to help meet that capacity need. They aren't necessarily very good at it. You have to add a lot of wind and solar and batteries that are extra, more than you would need just for carbon abatement to help meet the capacity need during the wintertime when they're not producing at high levels. So in effect, that policy just adds cost and really doesn't help to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And if you take that policy to its extreme in the red, this is where if you remove all gas generation from the system, all combustion-based generation, and don't even allow the possibility of a zero carbon or a carbon neutral fuel, and you're serving all of the load with wind and solar and battery technologies, the costs become really, really quite high. And the land use becomes significant, and the amount of offshore wind just becomes overwhelming. And so the costs, not only are the costs high, we think just practically the amount of infrastructure this would require, it doesn't really work. So some form of firm generation is needed to serve load reliably, even at zero carbon. And then the brown bubbles down below, you can see are the cost impacts of making new technologies available to help meet these goals. And so this just really underlines the value of the innovation portfolio that the EFI folks have been investigating. So if you go to the next slide, this slide really just tries to illustrate the challenge in kind of system dispatch terms. So what we've shown you here is a difficult week during the wintertime, just to kind of try to illustrate the challenge here. So the black line is electric load day by day throughout that week. You can see it's got a kind of a double hump pattern. It comes up in the morning and then up again in the evening. That's a typical heating demand. The yellow is solar and the blue is wind, and there is some. The brown below is nuclear. But on this winter week, loads are high, and there's just not nearly enough wind and solar to help serve all that load, all that area under the curve. So, you know, when 2/3 of your energy is coming from a weather-dependent resource, and the weather doesn't cooperate, then you could have a hole that's the size of 2/3 of your energy demand. And in fact, if you look at what happens at the end of day 4 and into day 5, about 2/3 of the system's load can't be met because there simply isn't enough energy and there hasn't been enough production close enough in time for the batteries to be of any use to store it. So to solve this problem, you really would need very long duration storage over days, multiple weeks, or some form of generation that you can turn on when you need it. And if you look at the bottom chart, this kind of shows you the energy balance week by week throughout the year. You know, it's in the wintertime, December, January is when you need this resource the most. A lot of weeks you don't need it at all. A little bit in the summertime. So again, this is where the dispatchable resource just plays a huge role to keep the lights on. Even if the fuel is expensive, you don't mind it so much because you really don't use it very much. If we don't have a zero carbon form of fuel, and this has to be natural gas, again, it's not, they're operating at low capacity factors, so you can meet a 2.5 million metric ton target. So if you go to the next slide, this will be my last one. Just kind of, again, highlighting the role of firm generation. The top charts show the amount of capacity over time between now and 2050. And the bottom charts show the capacity factor. So you can see, even though the total gigawatts of capacity grow, and that's really driven by the size of the need that we examined on the previous chart. the capacity factors shrink, and that's driven by the needs of the carbon target, which is binding. And then in 2050, we begin to see the emergence of a zero carbon fuel that helps to make even that small amount of remaining gas generation less carbon intensive. So I think with that, I'll turn it back over to Alex.
Great, thank you, Ani. So I first want to, I guess, motivate why we look at innovation in what is nominally a grid reliability report. I think what Arnie showed a couple slides ago is really instructive, that the availability of additional low carbon firm technologies that are kind of commercialized today can lower the cost of achieving deep decarbonization by half compared to our reference case, and eliminate some of the land use pressures of wind and solar in a region that has historically had difficulty siting new generation large-scale infrastructure projects. And so that's why we thought it was a good complement to look at an innovation portfolio that is grounded in the modeling results, that is region-specific, and that policymakers can use moving forward from this study. So some of EFI's previous work has been focused on regional innovation ecosystems and breakthrough technology needs for deep decarbonization. And one kind of insight is consistent. It's that innovation occurs at the local level, and coordinated efforts, again, locally, can accelerate the pace and depth of technology innovation. And fortunately, it won't be a surprise to many people on the phone. New England has one of the most robust ecosystems of clean energy innovation in the country, largely anchored by its top-tier universities. And on the right there is a map that shows a few of these universities and some of their clean energy research that is underway. You'll see ARPA-E features prominently throughout, and the role of the federal government in supporting local innovation capacity can't be overstated. So I think it's a really fruitful time for this report to be coming out, and a new administration that we anticipate will be a little more apt to fund clean energy innovation in regions like New England. If you go to the next slide, please. So we took a look at what New England has going on today in terms of its innovation ecosystem, looking at patent counts, looking at startups, new funding for new businesses. And there's a few areas that really stand out as kind of where New England is out front of the rest of the country. And these are biofuels, hydrogen technologies, and energy storage. When we compared these strengths of the region against the innovation needs that we identified in the power sector analysis that Arnie just walked us through, we singled out several areas where breakthrough innovations could lower the cost or improve the likelihood of achieving emissions reductions in the region. Specifically, advanced nuclear is a local innovation hotspot. New England is a local innovation hotspot for that we showed very explicitly its role in potentially reducing costs and land use implications of meeting deep decarbonization targets. Long duration storage can provide some options for meeting these multi-day wind and solar lulls that we walked through and at the hourly level a couple slides ago. And renewable fuels that can burn in existing generating facilities or with new combustion technologies, also really important enabler of the modeling results that we saw. So the full report that is out now, and I believe is linked in the Q&A, catalogs a lot of the region's existing innovation capabilities across several important technology areas. And we really encourage policymakers to pay close attention to that in the context of the reliability modeling as well. If you go to the next slide. And so that's all we had for presentation. We do have some backup slides. We're really hoping to start a conversation. So do drop your question in the Q&A. And I believe my colleague, Natalie Volk, will pose a question to the group.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. So one question we have is, what paths offer New England the best opportunities to achieve the low carbon goals on its own without the need for collaboration from other states and regions?
So that's a hard one. Well, I think one thing that our study shows is that making as many resource options available to the region as possible can help meet the reliability need that the modeling identifies. We do see a really important role for imports of hydro from Quebec and trading with its neighbors, though we are pretty modest in our assumptions about those trades. But I do think, pathways to get there absent regional collaboration would certainly focus on making as many technologies available to the system as is reasonable.
Yeah, I would just add there that, in a way, that's kind of what we've done here.
Mm.
I mean, yes, we have some imports of hydro from Quebec that we've assumed are available, and we've assumed a little bit of, obviously the interactions with New York ISO and New Brunswick that the ISO New England system already has. But we really haven't brought in massive amounts of clean energy from some other region. And we haven't assumed that New England, for example, might be a buyer of allowances rather than complying fully itself. So in effect, we said New England's going to go to net zero with 85% direct reductions. We kind of have modeled New England by itself meeting those goals. It could be the case, and this is one of the reasons why we wanted to pull out the dollar per ton number, because it is higher than what we've seen in other regions. So it could be the case that if New England were part of a national carbon regulatory system, which inshallah we will have at some point in the not too distant future, that New England might end up being a buyer and other regions might overcomply. The Midwest, where there's lots of coal generation to pull offline and lots of land available to develop wind and solar power, and maybe CCS will become a big technology in Texas and the Gulf Coast. I think other regions will have an easier time decarbonizing than New England will. So in effect, we've kind of modeled it hard. It's hard for New England to do it on its own. It's hard for New England to do it with existing technologies. There are a number of paths that could make this lower cost for New England and the country as a whole than what we've modeled here.
Great. So we have more questions coming in. The next one is from Michael Walsh. He's asking, are you assuming in-region geologic storage, or do you assume pipeline transport of CO2 to other regions?
I can take that. Based on our understanding of the geography and storage options in New England, we assume that it's all piped out of the region. So both hydrogen and CO2 include, so both CCS includes a pipeline adder. I believe it's 400 miles outside of the region for CO2, and the same thing with the hydrogen coming in. We assume hydrogen is produced outside the region and needs to be piped to New England.
And I think that highlights one of the really important policy findings of our report that I'd like to reiterate, is that all of these scenarios, all of the sensitivities imply new infrastructure gets built at an enormous scale. There's really none that kind of get away from that. And our base case includes some kind of hydrogen infrastructure, whether that could be repurposed. Existing gas pipelines is, we're agnostic on, but perhaps unlikely. And so, new linear infrastructure that crosses the region will be really important to achieving the scenarios modeled here, and not to mention transmission infrastructure as a key enabler too.
Great. So another question we have is from Andrew Place. He's asking, where are the CO2 sinks and hydrogen sources?
So in the report, we do include a map that shows geologic potential for underground CO2 storage, and that overlaps a lot with availability of hydrogen underground storage, so really any gas. And that's mostly south and west of the region in New York and Pennsylvania. We are agnostic as to where those sites are or should be when it comes to New England's priorities, but certainly the region doesn't have the geology, but the geology isn't so far away. It doesn't take crossing the country, it just takes crossing a few state boundaries.
Thank you. So the next question is from David Chu. Does your model assume any population growth in New England to 2050, or is electric capacity growth solely driven by decarbonization objectives?
Yeah, so we assume continued population and economic growth as what we've seen. So in effect, we have kind of a business as usual load growth forecast that we start with. We then, through the pathways analysis, do everything we can to implement energy efficiency measures to try to hold that growth to a minimum. And we largely are successful at keeping electricity demand flat in New England, even as the population and the economy continue to grow. And then new demands are layered on top from end uses in buildings and transport and industry that are electrifying. So that's how we get to the doubling of New England load by 2050. I mean, I'll just mention that could be higher if we were less successful at achieving efficiency than what we've assumed. If we're less successful at mitigating the peak load impacts of the building electrification. So we've assumed here that only that 40% of the heat pumps that are added in the region have electric resistance backup, which would kick in cold temperatures and really spike the electricity demand. The other 60% have some form of fuel backup or the ground source heat pumps. So the load growth assumption, the load growth could be higher than what we've modeled here.
Thank you, Arnie. So the next question we have is from Amlan Saha. He says, notice that a lot of the existing gas assets are retained, but they do not run much. How high do capacity prices rise / have to rise to provide adequate compensation to these units for them to stick around profitably?
So, you know, you can imagine, especially if we end up in a position where the region is short of capacity and it's relying on the capacity markets to drive new entries, so to drive to fully finance the construction of new gas plants. And if those resources aren't earning very much revenue from running, then in effect, the cost of capacity rises to the carrying cost of a new CT. So that may end up being $100, $120, $150 per kilowatt a year is sort of where you might see that top out. And that, I mean, you can find the ceiling just by calculating what you think is the fully loaded capital cost of a CT and assuming no market revenues.
Thank you. So the next question is from Philip Stevenson. He's asked us, would energy storage with long duration capabilities like what Form Energy is trying to bring to market have a shot at displacing the natural gas need? Or is long duration storage not a competitive option?
So yeah, I mean, in the long run, we think that technology has a huge amount of promise, or at least there's a huge amount of market value available to it. I don't think it's going to be easy to build new combustion-based resources in New England or really anywhere else. So any other resource that can provide those same types of services, I think would be a welcome addition to the toolkit. We haven't assumed that type of technology is available. But if it is, then again, that would be another thing to turn to potentially to help solve some of these hard challenges.
Yeah.
I'll just mention maybe, sorry, Alex, a couple more quick points. One of them is that the need is so large, the 37 gigawatts of firm capacity that's needed, that really to retire or eliminate all of that gas generation, you need to have 37 gigawatts of solutions. So any other solution or any other combination of solutions has to scale up very large to eliminate all the natural gas. So that's a challenge there. The other point that I'll make about the long duration storage is that it relies on surplus renewable or other zero carbon energy for charging. And so it doesn't get you out of the same land use issues that you might see in New England.
Yeah, that's well said, Arnie. The one thing I'll add to that, and it relates to the capacity price question, I think that there's a growing chorus of observers that note that the current market constructs that we have at the wholesale level might not sufficiently support the important role of firm generation that we've noted, or especially emerging energy storage technologies. We did not look at that explicitly in the report, but I think that the results of this study certainly lead one to question next, is the market adequate for sustaining the really important resource attributes that we find are so critical to meeting the deep decarbonization challenge.
Thanks, Alex. So our next question is from Henry Liu. He says, it seems like electrifying everything is the essence of achieving significant emissions reduction. Do you think the future electricity system will be more centralized, more distributed, a hybrid of the two, or a completely new electricity system?
Yeah, maybe I can start there. There's a lot in that question. So we've modeled two scenarios around whether electrify everything is the right way to go or not. I think there's still a fair amount of uncertainty out there about just the infrastructure needs that are required under the electrify everything scenario. And it's really all the way, it's from all the amounts of firm capacity that we've modeled here, it's new transmission infrastructure, and it's all the way out to the distribution system and into the homes. There's potentially significant upgrades required, especially in a cold climate, to make all that happen. So I think there's still a potential future in which at least some of that demand is met through a form of carbon neutral fuels. But all of our scenarios do have a lot of electrification. And they do have a challenge of taking energy from these centralized generation sources and delivering it to all the places where it's needed to keep people warm and to meet their mobility needs, even during polar vortex type of events. So I don't know what the right mix will be of distributed and utility scale. I think it will be a mix. I think the issue of resiliency and delivery reliability under these extreme conditions will become really important. And I don't think it's been well studied yet, but that'll be, I think, a big challenge as these systems roll out.
Thank you, Arnie. Our next question is from Liz Sherwood-Randall. She says, you have strikingly contrasted the cost of sustaining natural gas plants with the cost of investing in innovation. Have you generated analysis and recommendations regarding how to best manage the trade-offs that utilities will need to make in balancing reliability risks and financial costs while seeking to meet ambitious 2050 targets?
It's another big one. So we did not look at kind of the prioritization of deploying what we have today versus investing in continued innovation and reaping the economic gains tomorrow. I think from the EFI perspective, we're so far short of the level of funding that is warranted in the innovation space that it's almost a moot point, that every entity that can finance innovation, research, early stage deployment of cutting edge technologies should do so. And there should be policy and regulatory support to enable that action. And I think we're so far from the frontier of that not being a worthwhile financial investment that it's a little bit hard to say about what that particular trade space would look like, especially deeper as we get farther along the decarbonization curve.
Yeah, maybe I'll just comment that one from the reliability standpoint. In all of our modeling, we haven't assumed that any degradation in electric reliability would be acceptable. And that's, today, all the way along the pathway and all the way out through 2050. At the same time, our base case modeling, as I mentioned, is, let's say, somewhat conservative with respect to new technology availability. And, both of those are very deliberate. We want to show a viable pathway that achieves everyone's goals for the electric sector: low carbon, affordable, and reliable. Again, if new technologies come along and can help us solve some of these really difficult challenges, like how do you finance new fossil fuel infrastructure that may be needed for the next 10 or 15 years, and you're not sure if it's needed after that, If we knew in 15 years that a form of low carbon fuel would come along, and I saw a question about that, which maybe I'll just address here while I'm on the topic, which could be hydrogen, or it could be a biomass-based source of gas, or it could be a synthetic gas. And our study is a bit agnostic as to which of those it would be, although we've assumed hydrogen just for costing purposes. If we knew that we would have one of those in our future, that would make our decisions that we have to make today about near-term reliability investments much easier. If we knew that some other form, small modular reactors would be the preferred choice, that would also make our lives easier. Right now, our lives are very difficult because we have to make the investments needed to keep the lights on today while preparing for the transition. So I think what we showed here is a way to do that given what we know today. And again, if new technologies come along, that will help.
And importantly, to Arnie's point earlier, we assumed kind of a constant reliability requirements across time. I think the growing reliance on electricity for heating services, for transportation services, might even warrant a reconsideration of that reliability criteria. So I think it's a really interesting space to continue to research and look into.
Thanks, Alex and Arnie. So our next question is from Mary Beth Gentleman. She asks, do your incremental cost estimates include the transmission system upgrades necessary to integrate the amount of offshore wind assumed?
So yes, I mean, subject to the amount of uncertainty there is around exactly how much that transmission costs, but we basically assume 8 gigawatts of existing headroom, consistent with recent studies done in the region, and then everything else includes transmission upgrade costs.
Well, and those are both the undersea cables required to bring the power to shore, as well as beyond 8 gigawatts, we've also assumed some land-based transmission required to bring the power from the onshore delivery site to where the loads are.
That's right.
Alrighty, well, we have time for, I think, maybe 2 or 3 more questions since we have about 10 minutes left in our briefing. So this is from Dennis Meany. He's asking us, what are the assumptions on the cost of wind, solar, and batteries over time?
So again, our goal is to use publicly available, kind of credible sources. And so for offshore, onshore wind and solar, we're using cost information developed by NREL with then regional labor adjustments to those costs. For batteries, we rely on Lazard. So we're using publicly available costs. They all certainly fall over time. I think offshore wind probably has the steepest declines towards 2050, but they're all experiencing, pretty significant cost declines over the next 25, 30 years.
Thank you, Liz. Our next question is from Afshin Salehian. He's asking, what is the assumption behind the gas generation addition till 2050? Is it new pipelines to New England or foreign liquid natural gas?
Yeah, so we're basically agnostic to where the gas comes from. We assume the cost of new gas, whether or not that is existing pipelines because of electrification. So basically, where your gas comes from, shifting away from heating homes towards the power sector, or if you build new infrastructure. We don't take a stance, but then our natural gas plant costs are based on again NREL.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add that the issues of fuel security we think only get harder actually under these scenarios because the electric demand becomes winter peaking. So to the extent that the gas demand today is winter peaking and the electric demand is summer peaking, there's a little bit of headroom that can be utilized to deliver gas to the generators during the summertime peak. Once those peaks start to stack on top of each other, then it really exacerbates the problem of fuel security. At the same time, our assumption is reducing gas consumption in buildings and industry. So there's a direct reduction in natural gas use as well. What that means for demand on the design day, we haven't looked at that in detail. Again, there's these two forces that are kind of moving in opposite directions. But to the extent that you're burning gas, even in combined cycle plants, to meet electricity demand for an extreme cold winter day, if that electricity demand is to generate power for resistors, you may end up with higher gas demand on the peak day, design day, even as gas throughput is lower throughout the year, and carbon emissions from natural gas are less throughout the year.
Yeah, and I just add that I think that question is a really important question that kind of flows out of this research that certainly the region should take a good hard look at. I think it's a really interesting dynamic to have the volumes of gas used in the power sector decline so much in our base case and across all the scenarios, yet its peakiness increase in a way that I think is going to be a really difficult challenge and requires a lot of analysis about whether the existing infrastructure system can get that done.
Great. Our next question is from Phil Stevenson. He's asked, what were the biggest sensitivities that resulted in the estimated shares of solar versus onshore wind versus offshore wind in the forecast?
Yeah, the biggest difference we saw was the land use constraint. So again, we constrained solar to land equivalent to 4% of all farmland in New England. The lowest cost source of renewable energy that the model wanted to pick was onshore wind. That was also fairly constrained. Onshore solar was next, and then offshore wind, and then distributed solar. And it picks it based on value and as well as based on cost. So it's mixing and matching renewable resources that have complementary profiles to get to an optimal portfolio. But the model would have taken a lot of solar, and you can see that in the unconstrained land use case, where it builds a lot of onshore wind, a lot of utility scale solar, and far less offshore wind.
And maybe we can squeeze one or two more. We'll see after this question. So another question from Afshin Salihian. He's asked us, what are the reliability implications if we remove all the gas generation? How practical may that be?
Yeah, I mean, it's enormously challenging. And you can see that if you go to that chart that has the wintertime weeks. Yep, that one there. So you can see in the middle of on day 5, it's not the peak, the highest load day, but it's the day with the biggest gap, because it's a day when loads are pretty high, but it's still, right? There's no wind and hardly any solar. And this is typical. The highest demand conditions tend to occur when there's a high pressure system that sits over a region, and there's not a lot of air movement. So to try to scale these renewables up to fill that entire gray area under the curve on that upper chart, when you can see how low, with the low capacity factor you're getting from those resources in that week, it's just really, really challenging. I mean, in theory, you can make the model solve by, doubling the scale of all of the renewables in the system. So in theory it works, but in practice, even this amount of build out is enormously straining on the region's infrastructure. And I don't know, my personal opinion is it's not practical as a potential solution until you've got some other technology like very long duration storage, or like a hydrogen fuel, which you can turn on, if you can burn in either a combustion turbine or a fuel cell at very large scale to meet that 32 gigawatt gap that you see there.
And the study does play out that scenario and has some, both this graphic and what this might look like in a world without combustion at all, without gas at all. It also has kind of a total generation capacity build that would suggest, and it is enormous in a region that already has kind of difficulty citing large-scale infrastructure, it's really hard to imagine not having a firming resource available to the grid.
Alrighty, well, we're just about at time, so I think we can go ahead and wrap up there. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us. If we could just go back to that last slide, feel free to email the E3 team or the EFI team at those contacts right there on the slide. We will try to upload this presentation before the end of the week. That is the recording of this webinar. And then hopefully by the end of today on the EFI website, you can find these PowerPoint slides as a PDF. So again, thank you all so much. And yeah, I'll pass it back to Alex.
Thanks, Natalie. And actually, I just wanted to thank the E3 team. It's been a wonderful few months getting this project done. It's been a really exciting issue, very relevant, very salient, and it's been it's been great to be able to collaborate on it. So thanks, everyone, and thanks for all the observers with your time. We really appreciate it.
Yep, likewise. Thank you, Alex. Yep, and thanks to everyone for listening, and feel free to reach out to us if you have additional questions.
Great. Thanks.
All right, great. Bye, everyone.